The house was always full of
Just like that.
noise.
You're doing great.
It was
Try
never
this next
quiet,
part.
not really. There was the steady hum of the refrigerator, a low drone that was the bass note of the entire kitchen. There was the ticking of the living room clock, a sharp, precise sound that cut through other noises every second. There was the soft, rhythmic squeak of his father's favorite chair when he leaned back after work, a sound that meant the day was done and everyone was safe. For the boy, these weren't just sounds. They were the colors and shapes of his world. He had lost his sight to a fierce fever when he was very small, so his memories of light and faces were like faded, distant pictures. The world he lived in now was built entirely from sound, touch, and smell. He navigated it not with his eyes, but with a map drawn in his mind by echoes and vibrations. He knew his mother was coming down the hall long before she spoke. It was the particular shuffle slide of her worn house slippers on the wooden floor. His sister had a faster, lighter step, often accompanied by the rustle of a school bag or the jingle of bracelets. His father's arrival was announced first by the specific grumble of the car engine turning off, then by the heavy clunk of the door, and finally by the glorious jangling symphony of his keychain. The boy could tell his father's mood by how those keys sounded. A quick, cheerful jingle meant a good day. A slow, single clink into the palm meant he was tired. School was a vast ocean of confusing noise. The shouts in the hallway were a crashing wave, overwhelming and directionless. He preferred the classroom, where the sounds had more shape. But his favorite place, his secret sanctuary, was a dusty corner of the old school auditorium. That's where the piano lived. It was an upright piano, its dark wood scarred and scratched, its ivory keys yellowed with age. To most people, it was a forgotten piece of furniture. To the boy, it was a living creature. He would find his way to it during lunch breaks, when the auditorium was usually empty. He didn't go to play songs. He went to listen. His ritual was always the same. He would approach slowly, his hand outstretched until his fingertips met the cool, smooth wood of the side. He would trace the carvings he couldn't see, but knew by heart. Then he would sit on the creaky stool. He wouldn't plunge right in. First, he would just lay his palms flat on the closed lid, feeling the silence inside it. It felt like a sleeping animal. Then, very carefully, he would lift the fallboard, hearing the soft thump of the felt. He would let his right hand hover over the keys, feeling the slight chill that rose from them. And then he would press a single note. Maybe a middle C. He wouldn't strike it. He would press it slowly, letting the sound bloom. He would hold the key down, leaning forward until his right ear was almost touching the wood. He wasn't just hearing the note. He was feeling it. He felt the string vibrate deep inside the piano's body, a thrumming that traveled through the wood and into his bones. He could hear the tiny imperfections, a slight buzz on the F-sharp, a dull thud on the lower D. Each key had its own personality, its own soul. He was building a library in his mind. This sound was round and solid, like a smooth stone. That sound was bright and sharp, like a sliver of glass. This low one was a dark, rolling thunder, and that high one was a drop of water falling into a still pool. He didn't know their names yet, but he knew their voices. Of course, the other boys didn't understand. They saw a blind boy sitting alone at a piano, pressing one key over and over, his face blank and turned away. They saw something strange, something to mock. One day, as he was lost in the vibration of an A note, a shadow fell over him. Not a shadow of light, but a shadow of sound. The general noise of the room changed. The light, shuffling footsteps of 2 or 3 boys replaced the empty silence. He could smell their grass-stained sneakers and the tang of their sweat. "What are you doing?" A voice said. It was a voice he recognized. It belonged to one of the older boys, one who often spoke in a loud, performative way when others were around. The boy at the piano didn't answer. He just slowly took his finger off the key, letting the sound fade to nothing. "I think he's trying to play a song," another voice sniggered. "A really, really slow song." The first boy, the loud one, stepped closer. The boy at the piano could feel the air move. "You know you can't play piano if you're blind, right?" the older boy said, his tone pretending to be helpful. "You need to see the keys. You need to read music. It's a thing you see." The boy at the piano felt a hot flush creep up his neck. It wasn't anger at their words, not exactly. It was a feeling of profound violation. This was his private conversation with the sound, and they were shouting over it. He wanted to explain that he was reading the geography of the keyboard with his fingers, reading the story of the sound with his whole body. But the words stuck in his throat. His world was so hard to translate for people who lived in a world of sight. He simply shut the piano lid gently, the soft thud a full stop to the encounter. He slid off the stool and, using his hand to brush the edge of the piano as a guide, began to walk towards the aisle he knew led to the door. "See?" the loud boy said, his voice bouncing off the auditorium walls. "He doesn't even know where he's going. How's he gonna play Beethoven?" Their laughter followed him out, a harsh, clattering sound that was all attack and no resonance. It was the ugliest sound he knew. He walked down the familiar hall, his hand skimming the cool cinder-block wall. The sounds of the school around him, the distant slam of a locker, the squeak of a sneaker on linoleum felt different now. They felt like walls, not guides. He made his way to the pickup area, where the din of children and car engines was a predictable chaos. He stood still, waiting for the one sound that mattered. After a few minutes, he heard it, the specific, tired purr of his family's old sedan, and then the familiar, comforting call of his sister's voice. "Hey!" "Over here." He walked towards her voice, a small island in the noisy sea. He didn't tell her about the boys or the piano. That world was his. But as she chatted about her day, linking her arm loosely in his to guide him, he replayed the feeling of that single A note in his mind. The clean ring of it. The way it filled the empty space. It was a pure sound, untouched by the meanness that followed. It was his. And he knew, with a quiet certainty that sat deep in his stomach, that he needed to go back. The piano had more to tell him, and he was only just beginning to understand its language. The afternoon sun was warm on his face as he stood in the schoolyard, a few days after the boys had teased him at the piano. He was waiting for his sister. He could hear the swirl of activity around him, the shrieks of a game of tag, the thump of a basketball, the scattered conversations that flowed and ebbed like water. He stood very still, not because he was afraid to move, but because listening required his full attention. He was pinpointing his sister's voice in the crowd. There, he heard her laugh, a bright, bubbly sound, followed by the voices of two of her friends. He turned his head towards the sound and took a few careful steps in that direction, his cane held lightly, not sweeping, just touching the ground for confirmation. He didn't like to use it much here. He knew the pavement of this yard, the crack near the fence, the slight incline near the door. His sister saw him and called out, "Over here. We're just talking for a minute, okay?" He nodded and found a spot on a low, brick-retaining wall nearby to sit. He could feel the heat of the sun-baked bricks through his jeans. He set his backpack down and just listened. His sister and her friends were talking about a music teacher everyone thought was too strict, and about a test that had been harder than expected. It was ordinary talk, and he let it wash over him, distinguishing the voices. One friend had a higher, melodic tone. The other spoke in a quieter, more serious murmur. His sister's voice was always in the middle, full of energy. He was content to wait. He pulled a small, smooth stone from his pocket, a stone he'd found that morning because he liked its perfect oval shape. He rolled it between his fingers, feeling its cool, solid surface. Then, the soundscape changed. The pattern of footsteps approaching was different. Heavier, less certain, with a scuffing rhythm he recognized from the auditorium. It was the older boy, the loud one. And he wasn't alone. The boy with the stone could hear too, maybe 3 other sets of footsteps with him. The easy chatter of his sister's group stopped. "Well, look who it is," the loud boy said. His voice was aimed at the boy on the wall, but the performance was for the girls. The boy could hear it in the way the voice was pitched, a little louder than necessary. "The piano master. Practicing for your concert?" A slight heat crept up the back of the boy's neck. He kept rolling the stone in his hand. He said nothing. Silence, he had learned, was often the best reply. It didn't give them anything to grab onto. His sister spoke up, her voice tight. "Leave him alone. He's just waiting for me." "We're not bothering him," the loud boy said, his tone fake innocent. "We're just curious. He's always over at that old piano. What's the deal? You think you're gonna be, like, a famous musician or something?" One of the other boys snickered. The boy on the wall focused on the stone. "Smooth, cool, real. He likes the piano, so what?" His sister said, but her voice had a defensive edge. The boy could hear her embarrassment. It was a specific sound, a slight strain in the higher notes of her voice. Liking it and playing it are 2 different things, the loud boy said, moving a little closer. The boy on the wall could smell a strong, cheap body spray. "You gotta see to play. You need sheet music. It's a fact. Maybe he can play by ear," his sister's quieter friend offered softly, but the words were swallowed by the loud boy's confidence. "By ear? Please. He just sits there poking 1 key. Like this." The loud boy made a stupid plunking sound with his mouth. "That's not music. That's just noise." The boy on the wall stopped rolling the stone. He closed his fingers around it. The laughter of the other boys felt like little needles. It wasn't the words that hurt the most. It was the sound of his sister's tense silence. He could feel her shame radiating from her, hot and uncomfortable. She was ashamed for him, and that was a worse feeling than any tease. The loud boy, sensing he had an audience and was winning, went in for the finish. He puffed out his chest. The boy could hear the rustle of his jacket. "I'll tell you what. I'll make you a bet. A real one." The schoolyard seemed to grow quieter. The other sounds, the basketball, the tag game faded into the background. Everyone was listening now. "You say he can play? Okay. If he can go over to that piano right now and play a real song, not just 1 note, a real, actual song, I will buy him a piano. With my own money. A real one for his house." The declaration hung in the air. It was so outrageous, so impossible, that for a second there was utter silence. Then the other boys burst into loud, roaring laughter. It was the ultimate joke. A blind boy who poked at keys, playing a real song? And the price for this miracle would be a piano? It was the safest, funniest bet in the world. They were howling with the sheer cleverness of it. His sister made a small, choked sound. "That's not funny." "Come on," she said to her brother, her voice low and urgent. "Let's go. Mom's waiting." She came over and took his arm. Her grip was firm, pulling him up from the wall. Her hand was trembling. He could feel the rush of her anger and humiliation. She wanted to get him out of there, to hide him away from this cruel public joke. To protect him, he stood up. He tucked his smooth stone into his pocket. He could feel all their eyes on him, even if he couldn't see them. He could feel the expectation of his retreat. That was the script. He would be led away, a pitiful figure, and the boys would have their story, their victory. But something else was happening inside him. A strange calm was spreading from his center, cooling the heat on his neck. The library of sounds in his mind was very quiet, very still. And in that stillness, he heard something else. Not the boy's laughter, not his sister's ragged breathing. He heard the echo of the piano's A string. He heard the dark thunder of the low D. He felt the geography of the keys under his fingers. A landscape he knew better than the path from his bed to the bathroom. That his sister was pulling him gently, trying to guide him away from the wall, towards the gate. He took one small step with her. Then he stopped. He gently, very gently, pulled his arm from her grasp. "Wait," he said. His voice was quiet, but it didn't shake Dot. His sister froze. "What?" "No, let's just go." The laughter from the boys died down into confused snickers. They hadn't expected this. They had expected a retreat, not a pause. The boy turned his head, not towards the loud boy, but towards the school building, towards the auditorium. He knew the way. Every crack in the pavement, every step, every door. He didn't say another word. He just started walking. His steps were not hesitant or unsure. They were deliberate. He used his cane now. A light tap, tap, tap. It was more a formality than a necessity for this familiar route. The crowd of kids, his sister, the loud boy, and his friends, they all fell in behind him, a silent, stunned procession. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scuff of many feet on asphalt and the light, steady tap of his cane. He was leading them. He was leading them all to the piano. The joke had suddenly stopped being funny. The air was now thick with a tense, electric curiosity. What was he doing? Where was he going? He reached the heavy side door of the auditorium. He pushed it open, the familiar groan of its hinge like a greeting. He walked inside, the cool, dusty quiet of the big room swallowing the outside noises. He walked down the side aisle, his footsteps echoing softly. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the dark, silent shape of the old upright piano. He stood before it for a moment, his head slightly bowed. The others filed into the rows of seats, whispering, shuffling. He didn't hear them. He was listening to the silence of the piano. He reached out and let his fingertips brush the scarred wood of its side. He found the creaky stool. He sat down. He lifted the fallboard. The soft thump was deafening in the quiet room. He let his hands rest just above the keys. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs. It wasn't a breath of fear. It was the breath you take before you speak a truth you've known your whole life. The room held its breath with him. The silence in the auditorium was thick and heavy. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a held breath, of a crowd waiting for something to go wrong. The boy could feel the pressure of all those eyes on his back, a physical weight. He could hear the rustle of someone shifting in a seat, a faint cough from the back. He could smell the old dust of the velvet curtains, and the faint, lingering trace of the loud boy's body spray. His hands hovered over the keys. They weren't shaking. They felt calm, steady. They felt like they were coming home. For a moment, he did nothing. He wasn't trying to remember a song. He wasn't searching for a place to start. He was listening. In his mind, he wasn't in a dusty room full of skeptical kids. He was somewhere else. He was in the quiet of his own room, listening to the rain tap against the window. He was remembering a piece of music his father would sometimes play on the old radio on Sunday afternoons. It wasn't pop music. It was something classical, something with a slow, sad, beautiful melody that had woven itself into his memory years ago. He didn't know its name. He only knew its feeling. It felt like a story told in shades of blue and gray, like longing for something just out of reach. His right index finger moved. It didn't stab at a key. It descended with a gentle firmness onto middle C dot. The note rang out, clear and pure in the silent room. It wasn't the timid plink the boys had mocked. It was a full, round tone that seemed to hang in the air, vibrating. He let it fade almost completely. Then, with his left hand, he pressed a lower note, and G, it was a soft, deep shadow to the brighter sound. Then another note with his right, and E, he wasn't playing a melody yet. He was building a foundation, laying down the ground on which the story would walk. Each chord was slow, thoughtful, perfectly placed. The sounds blended together, creating a mood that was immediately solemn and beautiful. The scattered whispers in the seats stopped dead. He began the main melody with his right hand. It was a simple, rising line of notes, but he played it with a touch so delicate it was heartbreaking. He wasn't just hitting keys. He was speaking with them. He could feel the vibration of each string travel up through the key, into his finger, through his arm. He was listening with his whole body, adjusting his touch so that one note would sing a little longer, so another would be just a whisper. His left hand began to move with more purpose now. Not just single notes, but soft, rolling chords that flowed like a deep, quiet river beneath the melody. The two hands worked together, separate but perfectly connected. The music swelled gently, then faded, then swelled again. It was full of spaces, of breaths. It sounded like someone remembering a happy day that was also a little sad. Because it was over Dot at the back of the room, his sister stood frozen. Her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her mouth. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, filling with tears she didn't understand. She was watching her brother, but she wasn't seeing the blind boy the school knew. She was seeing a person she had never met before. His face, usually so still and listening, was alive with expression. His head tilted slightly, following the rise and fall of the phrases he was creating. A small, focused frown of concentration was between his eyebrows, but around his mouth there was the faintest suggestion of something else, not a smile, but a kind of peaceful certainty. This was her brother who hated loud noises. This was her brother who she guided through crowded halls. This was her brother who she sometimes, in her most secret thoughts, worried would always need protecting. And here he was, fearless, speaking a language more eloquent than anything she could manage, creating a beauty that made her heart ache. The embarrassment she had felt outside was gone, earned away by a shock so profound it felt like vertigo. Asterisk, how long has this been in him? She thought. Asterisk, how did I not know? Asterisk, the loud boy who had made the bet was no longer leaning back in his seat with a smirk. He was sitting straight up, his mouth slightly open. The color had drained from his face. The clever joke, the safe bet, was crumbling into dust around him, and all he could do was watch. The sound filling the room was undeniable. It was real music. Complex, emotional, skilled music. It wasn't chopsticks. It was something from another world. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The promise he had made, "I'll buy him a piano," echoed in his head, not as a boast anymore, but as a terrifying debt. But even that shock was secondary to the sheer, unbelievable thing happening in front of him. The boy he had pitied and mocked was doing something he himself could never, ever do. A teacher, on her way to the staff room, had paused in the hallway outside the auditorium doors. She was an older woman who taught history. She had heard the first few notes and stopped, her hand on the door handle. She had quietly pushed the door open a crack and slipped in, standing in the shadows at the back. She listened, her professional sternness melting into an expression of wonder. She watched the boy's hands, his posture, the absolute connection between him and the instrument. This wasn't practice. This wasn't a lesson. This was a soul coming through the fingertips. The boy at the piano was gone from the room. He was inside the music. His fingers knew where to go. They danced over the slight gaps between the chipped keys, found the black notes without hesitation, and spanned chords that fit his small hands perfectly. He wasn't thinking about technique. He was feeling. He was translating the memory of that Sunday afternoon radio piece, filtering it through his own inner world of darkness and sound. The minor keys sounded like the quiet of his room at night. The rising melody felt like hope. The deep, resonant bass notes were the steady, comforting presence of his father nearby. He built the piece to a gentle peak, a moment of sweetest sorrow, and then began to bring it back down. The melody fragmented into echoes of itself. The chords became simpler, more spaced apart. The music was slowly saying goodbye. He ended on a single, high, clear note, held just long enough for it to shine like a single star in a darkening sky. And then he lifted his finger. The sound died away into a silence that was completely different from the one that had begun in the performance. This silence was awestruck. It was full. It was the silence that happens when something true has been spoken, and words would only spoil it. The boy lowered his hands into his lap. He sat very still on the creaky stool, his head still slightly bent. He was breathing steadily, coming back to the room, feeling the hard wood under him, hearing the shift of fabric as someone in the audience moved. The world of the music receded, leaving the dusty auditorium in its place. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from the back of the room, a single clear sound broke the spell. Clap. It was the history teacher. She brought her hands together again, slowly, firmly. Clap. Then another person joined. And another. It wasn't wild, cheering applause. It was slower, deeper, more respectful. It was the kind of applause that acknowledges not just entertainment, but a gift that has been witnessed. The sound filled the room, a warm human wave of noise. The boy on the stool didn't turn around. He didn't bow. He simply reached out with one hand and gently touched the keys again, not to play, but as if to thank the piano. Then he carefully closed the fallboard over them, the soft thud a final punctuation mark. He stood up. He turned towards the sound of the clapping, his face calm, as if he had simply finished a conversation he needed to have. The performance was over. But for everyone in that room, especially for his sister standing with tears now streaming freely down her face, everything had just begun. The applause didn't last long. It faded into a buzzing, stunned silence, broken by shuffling feet and whispered exclamations. The boy stood by the piano, one hand resting lightly on its side. He didn't know what to do next. The journey had been to the piano. The path back seemed unclear. His sister was the first to move. She wiped her cheeks roughly with the back of her hand, smearing the tears, and practically ran down the aisle. She didn't grab his arm this time. She stopped in front of him, her breath coming in little hitches. How? Was the only word she could push out. It was a breath, not a question. He tilted his head, a familiar listening gesture. I just know the sounds, he said, his voice soft. It seemed so simple to him. The history teacher walked down, her sensible shoes making a firm, kind sound on the wooden floor. She put a gentle hand on his sister's shoulder, but she spoke to him. That was extraordinary, young man. Truly. Do you know what you were playing? He shook his head slowly. It's from the radio. My dad listens sometimes. The teacher nodded, a smile in her voice. It sounded like a piece by Eric Satie. Very beautiful. And you learned it just by listening? He nodded. The crowd of kids was beginning to disperse, muttering among themselves, casting long, confused looks back at the piano. The loud boy and his friends had vanished, slipping out a side door the moment the clapping started. Their world tilted off its axis. The walk home was quiet. But the silence between the brother and sister was entirely new. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of shared space or the tense quiet of the afternoon's shame. It was a silence full of unspoken things. She didn't guide him by the arm. She walked beside him, her steps automatically matching his slower, more careful pace. She kept looking at his profile, at his calm, focused face, as if seeing a stranger and her brother at the same time. "All those times you went to the auditorium," she began. "I was listening," he finished. "That night, the house was filled with a different kind of noise." His sister couldn't contain it. She burst through the front door ahead of him, her school bag tumbling to the floor. "Mom, Dad, you have to hear what happened." She was tripping over her words, telling the story in a jumbled rush, the tease, the stupid bet, the walk to the piano, the music. Their parents listened, their expressions shifting from concern to confusion to dawning disbelief. They looked at their son, who was quietly taking off his shoes by the door, lining them up neatly, just so. "Son," his father said, his voice careful, "is this true?" The boy nodded. "I played the piano. Can you play something for us?" His mother asked, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He shook his head. "Not without the piano." That was the first concrete change. The next day, his father didn't go to work. He made phone calls. He had a friend who knew a music teacher. Not a school teacher, but a private tutor, a serious woman who taught classical piano. His father, a practical man who fixed machinery for a living, begged for a favor. "Just listen to him," he said into the phone. "For 10 minutes. That's all I asked." 2 days later, they were in the teacher's small studio. It smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The piano there was a grand, sleek and black, and terrifyingly professional. The teacher was a woman with a quiet voice and hands that looked strong. She didn't speak down to him. She simply said, "Your father tells me you have a good ear. Show me." She played a single note on the grand piano. "What is that?" "See?" he said immediately. She played a chord. "Can you tell me the notes?" He listened, his head cocked. F, A, C. He was right. She played a rapid random sequence of 5 notes. He repeated them back, slowly, perfectly, on the first try. Her professional reserve flickered. She had him sit at the piano. She placed his hands on the keys. She gave him a simple 5-finger exercise to play by copying her. He mirrored it back without error. Then she asked him to play something he knew. He played the same sad, beautiful piece from the auditorium. In the quiet, close room, on this better piano, it sounded even more clear, more heartfelt. When he finished, the teacher was silent for a long time. She turned to his parents, who were sitting on a small couch, holding each other's hands tightly. "What your son has," she said, choosing her words with precision, "is called perfect pitch. It's very rare. It means he can identify or recreate any musical note without a reference. But it's more than that. He has an intuitive understanding of music, an emotional connection. He's not just copying sounds. He's interpreting them." She looked at the boy, who was sitting quietly, waiting. "With training," she said, "with proper technique to match what his ear already knows, he could do remarkable things." The world in their small house seemed to expand and shrink at the same time. The worry that had always been there, a low hum about their blind son's future, didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It transformed into a new, daunting question. How do we help him? Private lessons cost money. A piano of their own was a dream for another life. Meanwhile, the story at school had become legend. It warped and grew in the telling. But the core truth remained. The blind boy who was teased could play like an angel. The loud boy, to his credit, didn't try to deny the bet. Instead, he did something unexpected. He was seen talking seriously to a few friends. He went to the history teacher who had applauded. He was awkward, ashamed but determined. He didn't have the money for a piano. Nobody expected him to. But he started a collection. A jar with a handwritten label appeared in the school cafeteria for a piano fund. At first, kids put in spare change, mostly as a joke. But then a few teachers added some bills. Someone's parent, who had heard the story, sent $20. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough for a real piano. But it was a start, and it was something. The gesture, the attempt to make good on a cruel joke, meant more than the money. The real turning point came from the music teacher herself. She called the boy's father. "I will teach him," she said, "for a very reduced fee. For now, we will consider the first few months an assessment." It was a kind lie. They all knew it was charity, but it was charity offered with such respect that it didn't feel like pity. And she had another idea. "There is an old electronic keyboard," she said. "It has weighted keys that feel almost like a real piano. It's sitting in my storage room. He can take it home. He needs to practice." The day they brought the keyboard home was the day the house found its new sound. It wasn't the rich, full tone of the auditorium's upright or the teacher's grand. It was a little tinny, a little digital. But to the boy, it was a universe. He could sit in his room and explore. He practiced the finger exercises the teacher gave him. He replayed the pieces from his memory. He began to make up little melodies of his own, songs that sounded like the rain, or like his sister laughing, or like the steady hum of the refrigerator. His family would stop what they were doing to listen. His mother would pause while washing dishes, her hands in the warm water, just smiling. His father would turn off the radio and sit in his chair, listening to this new, complex language his son was speaking. His sister would lie on her bed, her homework forgotten, just hearing him play in the next room. They weren't just hearing music. They were finally hearing him. They were listening to a part of their son and brother that had been silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because they hadn't yet learned how to hear it. The keyboard in the corner of his room wasn't just an instrument. It was a door. And for the first time, they were all on the other side of it, in the bright, surprising world he had been living in all along. The electronic keyboard wasn't a piano, but it became the heart of the house. It sat in the corner of his room, a black plastic rectangle on a flimsy stand, with a single headphones jack so he could practice in silence. But he rarely used the headphones. The sounds he made, even through the small speakers, were a new part of the family's daily music. His lessons with the teacher were hard. For the first time, he had to think about his hands, about curved fingers, about wrist positions, about scales and arpeggios that were boring, but she explained, were the bricks and mortar for building music. It was frustrating. His ear knew where the beautiful things were, but his fingers were clumsy students. He would get a phrase perfectly in his mind, only to have it stumble and fall apart because his fourth finger was weak or his thumbs got tangled. Some days, he would come home and just sit on his bed. Facing away from the keyboard, his shoulders slumped. The world of structured learning was so different from his private world of listening and feeling. His father would hear the silence, different from the usual afternoon practice, and would come in. He wouldn't give a pep talk. He'd just sit next to him, the bed springs creaking under his weight. He'd talk about his own work, about a stubborn engine that wouldn't start, about how sometimes you have to take the whole thing apart just to find one tiny, greasy problem. The frustration means you care, his father would say. If it was easy, it wouldn't be worth much. Then he'd leave. And a little while later, the slow, deliberate sound of scales would start again from the keyboard, each note a step on a difficult, necessary road. His sister became his unofficial page-turner and finder of things. She would sit with him, a library book of music braille, open between them, a system of raised dots he was slowly painstakingly learning. She couldn't read the dots, but she could read the song titles in print at the top of the page. "This one is called Arabesque," she'd say. "It sounds like a swirl." Or, "This one is just scales, but it says it's in C minor. That sounds sad, right?" She helped him organize the recorded lessons from his teacher on his simple audio player. Labeling them in her messy handwriting, he couldn't see but trusted. The loud boy from school, the one who made the bet, never quite apologized. But he did something else. He nodded at him in the hall. Once, when a group of younger kids were snickering near his locker, the loud boy told them to cut it out in a gruff voice that carried authority. It wasn't friendship, but it was a truce. The jar in the cafeteria eventually had $83.47 in it. The loud boy and his friends brought it to the history teacher, who passed it to the family. They used it to buy a sturdy, proper bench for the keyboard, one that wouldn't wobble. Months turned, and the seasons changed. The boy could tell by the sounds from the open window. The chirping birds of spring were replaced by the heavy buzz of summer insects, then by the rustle of dry autumn leaves. His hands grew stronger. The boring exercises began to make sense, like learning the alphabet before you can write a story. He started to blend the teacher's techniques with the music in his head. One chilly evening, his teacher came to their house for the lesson. This was unusual. She always taught in her studio. But she had asked. The family was nervous, straightening up, offering tea. She sat on the couch in the small living room. "Play for me," she said to the boy. "Not an exercise. Play something you love." He sat at the keyboard in the corner of the room. His family was there, his mother perched on the arm of his father's chair, his sister curled on the floor. He thought for a moment. He didn't play the sad piece from the auditorium. That was an old voice. He played something new he had been piecing together. It started with a low repeating pattern in his left hand, like footsteps on a familiar path. His right hand came in with a melody that was questioning at first, then playful, then soared into something bright and hopeful. It wasn't a famous piece. It was his. It was the sound of his house in the morning, of his father's keys, of his sister's laugh, of the frustrating scales that finally clicked, of the feeling of rain on his face. He didn't know how to say those things in words, so he said them in notes. When he finished, his teacher was quiet. Then she said, "You are no longer just a student with perfect pitch. You are becoming a musician." She turned to his parents. "There is a small recital in 2 months. At the community hall. My students play. It's informal. I would like him to play that piece. The one he just played. A public performance?" The air in the room went tight. His mother's hand flew to her mouth. His father gripped the arm of the chair. The boy himself felt a flutter of cold fear in his chest. The auditorium had been a reaction, a moment of defiance. This was a choice, an invitation to be seen and heard all over again. "It is his choice," the teacher said gently, looking at the boy. "But music is a gift, and gifts, in the end, are meant to be shared. Think about it." He did think about it. For days, he thought of little else. The fear was a heavy stone. What if he forgot the notes? What if his hands froze? What if people listened and thought it was just noise? The memory of the older boy's laughter still echoed, faint but there. He was practicing one afternoon, a difficult passage that kept tripping him up. He played it wrong, again and again. He slammed his hands down on the keys in a crash of discordant sound, then buried his face in his hands. His sister, who was doing homework at his desk, didn't tell him it was okay. She didn't try to cheer him up. After a minute, she said, "You know, the thing in the community hall. It's probably just a bunch of parents on fold-in chairs. They'll be listening to their own kids. They probably won't even be paying that much attention." He lifted his head. "Really?" "Yeah," she said, her voice casual. "And half of them will be worrying about whether they left the oven on. It's not a big deal. It's just a room with a piano. A better one than this, probably." Her words did something strange. They made the recital smaller, less monstrous. It was just a room. Another piano. He took a deep breath, placed his hands correctly on the keys, and played the passage slowly, perfectly. "I'll do it," he said, not turning around. The day of the requiem arrived. He wore a stiff, new shirt that scratched his neck. The community hall was exactly as his sister had described. Folding chairs, a buzz of conversation, the scent of floor polish and perfume. He could hear the other students play careful, sometimes stumbling versions of For Elise and minuets. His teacher announced his name and the piece, simply calling it an original composition. He walked onto the small stage, found the piano bench with his shin, and sat down. The piano wasn't upright, but it was well tuned. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys. They were smooth and cool. He placed his hands in his lap, took a breath that was shakier than he wanted, and began. The first few notes were soft, tentative. He could hear the rustle of the audience. But then he found the low, walking rhythm with his left hand. He fell into it. The fear melted away, because the music was louder inside him than the fear. He played his piece. He played the footsteps, the question, the playfulness, the hope. He played his home. He forgot about the folding chairs, the people, the scratchy shirt. He was just in the conversation between his hands and the sound. When the last note faded, the applause was warm and immediate. It was polite, appreciative. He stood, turned toward the sound, and gave a small, awkward bow as his teacher had shown him. It was over. Walking off the stage, his sister was there. She didn't say, "You were great." She squeezed his hand quickly, a sharp, happy pulse. "You didn't mess up," she whispered, and that, from her, was the highest praise. That night, at home, the house settled into its normal noises. The dishwasher hummed. The clock ticked. His father's chair squeaked. He sat in his room, not at the keyboard, just on his bed, listening to it all. His mother came in and sat beside him, putting an arm around his shoulders. She didn't speak for a long time. "I heard so much today," she said finally, her voice thick. "I heard. You." He leaned his head against her. He understood. The piano, the recital, the lessons, they weren't about becoming famous. They were a bridge. The music was the language he had used, finally, to show them who he was. The boy they loved, who lived in the world of sound, had found a way to let them in. The keyboard in the corner was quiet now, just a piece of plastic and wire. But the understanding it had brought into the house filled every room, a quiet, lasting music of its own.